For more than half a century, the Mongol name carried a meaning far greater than armies or banners. It meant terror that arrived before soldiers did. Cities surrendered without siege. Armies scattered without engagement. Fear became the Mongols' most reliable ally, spreading faster than their horses could ride. This reputation was not accidental. Mongol commanders understood that terror can serve strength. A city that opened its gates required no battle. A kingdom that collapsed internally spared Mongol forces the cost of conquest. Violence was used selectively, then spoken of endlessly. In Eastern Europe, this terror had already proven devastating. In 1241, Mongol forces crushed Polish and Hungarian armies with shocking efficiency. The lesson Europe absorbed was simple and paralyzing. Resistance was futile. But terror has limits. It depends on memory, and memory fades unevenly. In regions that survived long enough to observe Mongol behavior closely, fear began to turn into understanding. Patterns emerged. Habits repeated. What once felt supernatural began to look human. By the late 13th century, the Mongol world itself had changed. The great unified empire of earlier decades had fractured into competing khanates. Raids replaced grand invasions. Detached forces operated far from central authority, driven more by opportunity than inevitability. It was in this context that Mongol forces returned to Polish lands in 1288. Not as an overwhelming tide, but as a hardened raiding horde, confident that terror alone would clear their path. They believed Poland would respond as it had before, with panic, flight, and collapse. They were wrong. What awaited them was not defiance fueled by bravery, but resistance shaped by memory. Poland did not seek glory. It sought survival. And survival required patience, restraint, and something the Mongols rarely encountered in Europe: deliberate preparation. The Mongol invasion of 1241 did not simply devastate Poland. It restructured how Polish leaders understood war. Entire regions were burned, armies destroyed, and political authority shaken. Yet unlike kingdoms that collapsed entirely, Poland endured long enough to remember how the disaster unfolded, and why. The Polish response to defeat was not immediate revenge. It was silence, observation, and rebuilding. Fortifications were repaired slowly. Settlements relocated away from open plains. Roads once used for trade were reconsidered as invasion corridors. Polish nobles and commanders paid close attention to Mongol habits. Survivors spoke of speed, feigned retreats, and relentless pursuit. These accounts were not dismissed as chaos or panic. They were compared, repeated, and refined into understanding. What emerged was a dangerous realization. The Mongols were not unstoppable because they were invincible. They were unstoppable because their enemies reacted predictably. Panic created pursuit. Pursuit created isolation. Isolation created destruction. Polish commanders concluded that survival depended on resisting instinct. The impulse to meet the Mongols in open battle had proven disastrous. So too had the urge to chase retreating riders. Victory, if possible at all, would require denying the Mongols their preferred rhythm. Geography offered an advantage that brute force could not. Poland's forests, marshlands, and narrow river crossings disrupted cavalry movement. These landscapes were not ideal for pursuit, but they were ideal for control. By the late 13th century, Polish forces were smaller than those of the Mongols and poor in equipment. But they were no longer naive. They understood that endurance mattered more than spectacle, and preparation more than pride. When reports arrived in 1288 of Mongol movement toward Polish lands, there was no mass flight. Bells did not ring in panic. Instead, messengers were sent quietly, and preparations began without announcement. The Polish objective was not annihilation. It was containment. Delay. Attrition. If the Mongols could be slowed, misdirected, and drawn into unfavorable ground, terror would lose its power. By the time the Mongol horde crossed into Poland in 1288, it faced a society that no longer feared the unknown. The fear remained, but it was disciplined, measured, and directed. The conditions for a trap were already in place. The Mongol force that entered Poland in 1288 was not the same instrument that had shattered Eastern Europe decades earlier. It was smaller, detached, and operating at the edge of a fragmented empire. Authority was no longer unified. Campaigns were shaped less by grand strategy than by opportunity, tribute, and habit. For Mongol commanders, Poland remained unfinished business. It was a land that had submitted once through collapse, not conquest. In their view, it was still vulnerable to intimidation. A renewed raid promised wealth, captives, and a reminder of Mongol dominance along Europe's frontier. This campaign was not designed for occupation. It was designed for speed. The Mongols expected to move quickly, provoke flight, and withdraw before resistance could organize. Their confidence rested not on numbers, but on memory, specifically Europe's memory of fear. But memory cuts both ways. The Mongols assumed that terror endured unchanged. They did not account for the way fear evolves once it has been survived. In Poland, terror had been studied, not mythologized. The Mongol force moved without heavy siege equipment, relying on intimidation rather than assault. This choice limited their options. Fortified towns that refused to open their gates were bypassed. Each bypass preserved momentum, but also reduced control. As the horde advanced deeper, it stretched itself thin. Detachments spread out to forage and raid. Communication weakened across forests and marshes. Speed remained, but cohesion diminished. This fragmentation was familiar behavior. It had worked before. Enemies who panicked could not exploit it. Enemies who fled left the Mongols free to strike isolated targets. What changed in 1288 was not Mongol practice, but Polish response. Polish forces avoided open confrontation. They did not rush to defend every settlement. Instead, they watched. Mongol movements were tracked quietly. Routes were anticipated. Forest paths and river crossings became points of interest rather than obstacles. To the Mongols, this absence of resistance appeared encouraging. There were no massed armies. No dramatic challenge. Silence reinforced the belief that fear was still doing its work. The deeper they rode, the more confident they became. What they did not see was preparation unfolding beyond their line of sight. Polish commanders did not intend to meet the Mongols in battle. They intended to let the landscape fight first, to delay, divide, and exhaust before striking. By late winter, the Mongol horde had entered terrain that limited rapid maneuver. Forests narrowed movement. Marshy ground slowed horses. Withdrawal routes lengthened. The advantages of speed began to erode, not through force, but through geography. Still, the Mongols pressed forward. Habit overruled caution. They had crossed hostile lands before and survived through aggression. What awaited them now was not resistance fueled by desperation, but restraint shaped by memory. The Mongol horde did not enter the trap all at once. It drifted into it gradually, over days, through habit rather than force. Riders followed familiar patterns, moving quickly where space allowed, slowing where terrain narrowed, assuming that resistance would eventually reveal itself through flight. Polish forces did not block their advance. They yielded ground, deliberately guiding movement without contact. Villages were abandoned but not burned. Roads remained open just long enough to appear safe. The absence of confrontation preserved Mongol confidence. Forests closed around the Mongol column. Visibility shortened. Movement compressed. Riders adjusted spacing instinctively, but coordination suffered. Signals traveled poorly through trees and winter haze. What had once been fluid began to feel constrained. Polish scouts tracked the horde from the edges of sight. They did not harass or provoke. They counted riders, noted detachments, and followed routes that could not easily be reversed. The goal was not engagement, but commitment. The Mongols responded as they always had, by spreading out. Smaller groups detached to forage and raid. This preserved speed, but weakened cohesion. Each separation was minor. Together, they created vulnerability. Polish commanders waited. They allowed distance to grow between detachments and the main body. Paths once wide enough for rapid retreat narrowed behind the Mongols as weather worsened and terrain softened. When contact finally occurred, it was brief and controlled. A Polish unit struck the edge of a Mongol detachment, then withdrew immediately. There was no pursuit, no prolonged fighting. Just confirmation that resistance now existed, and that it was selective. The Mongols attempted to respond with aggression, but the terrain denied them clarity. Pursuit led into narrower ground. Forests broke formations. Horses tired quickly. Each attempt to impose speed produced friction instead. More Polish attacks followed, not as battles, but interruptions. Supplies were targeted. Isolated riders vanished. Rest became difficult. The Mongols were forced to remain mounted and alert, draining endurance without decisive engagement. By the time Mongol commanders recognized the pattern, the options available to them had narrowed. Withdrawal required coordination they no longer possessed. Advance offered no relief. What had begun as a raid was becoming entrapment through exhaustion. The trap was not a single location. It was a condition. The Mongols were surrounded not by armies, but by limitation, terrain, weather, distance, and an enemy that refused to reveal itself fully. Terror had lost its voice. The Polish forces had not challenged the Mongols directly, and so fear had nothing to answer. What remained was a horde far from open ground, moving slowly through hostile terrain, with no clear enemy and no clear exit. By early spring, the Mongol force in Poland no longer moved as a unified body. The forests and marshes had thinned their cohesion. Supplies had dwindled. Horses showed strain from poor grazing and wet ground. The campaign's tempo had slowed to something unfamiliar. Polish commanders chose their moment carefully. When the horde began consolidating for withdrawal, its detachments were separated by terrain and distance. This was the first time Polish forces committed to sustained engagement. The attack did not begin with a charge across open fields. It began in narrow crossings, river bends, forest exits, marshy clearings. Mongol units attempting to regroup found themselves struck from multiple directions, unable to maneuver freely. Mongol commanders attempted to impose order. Signals were given. Riders were redirected. But speed, once their greatest advantage, could not be restored in confined ground. Retreat routes overlapped and clogged. Polish forces pressed without overextending. They avoided deep pursuit into uncertain ground. Units struck, withdrew, and struck again. The pattern mirrored Mongol tactics, but reversed their purpose. Gradually, the Mongol horde fractured. Some groups escaped eastward. Others were cut down attempting to break through marshland. Losses mounted, not in a single battlefield collapse, but in repeated, exhausting encounters. The psychological reversal was as significant as the physical one. Mongol terror had depended on momentum and confidence. Now that confidence faltered. The Polish refusal to panic denied the Mongols the narrative they relied upon. By the time surviving Mongol forces withdrew from Polish territory, the raid had failed its purpose. It had not provoked collapse. It had not extracted submission. It had not reinforced terror. Instead, it had exposed vulnerability. Poland did not pursue far beyond its borders. The objective had never been conquest. It had been survival and containment. In that, the campaign succeeded decisively. The 1288 campaign did not end the Mongol presence in Eastern Europe entirely. Raids would continue. but never again would a Mongol horde enter Poland, assuming terror alone would clear its path. What Poland demonstrated in 1288 was not superior strength. It demonstrated adaptation. The Mongols were not defeated by bravery alone, nor by overwhelming force. They were defeated by patience, memory, and refusal to conform to expectation. Beyond terror lies comprehension, and once fear is understood, it can be resisted. In the forests of Poland, the Mongol horde encountered an enemy that no longer reacted predictably. That change, not a single battle, decimated the campaign.